Tonight, take a deep breath, relax, and let us slowly explore the story of bread. Get comfortable wherever you are right now. Pull the blanket up a little higher, if you like. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day fall away from you, because we are going somewhere very old tonight. We are going back to the very beginning of something you have probably never thought much about, something so ordinary that it hides in plain sight on every kitchen counter and every dinner table in the world. We are going to talk about bread. Just bread. The quietest, most familiar food in the world. The thing you might have eaten this morning without a second thought. The thing sitting in a bag on your counter right now, soft and sliced and utterly unremarkable. And yet, if you pull on the thread of bread's history, the whole tapestry of human civilization comes unraveled with it. Now, that might not sound like the most interesting subject in the world, and that is perfectly fine. But I want you to consider something as you settle in. Bread is not just food. It is, in a way, the very foundation of human civilization itself. The story of bread is the story of how we stopped wandering and started building. It is the story of the first cities, the first written languages, the first laws. It is the story of empires that rose on mountains of grain and revolutions that erupted when the grain ran out. Bread has been a marker of wealth and a symbol of poverty. It has been the daily wage of pyramid builders and the cause of riots that toppled kings. It has divided entire religions over the question of whether a loaf should rise or remain flat. And it all begins with a handful of wild grass seeds gathered by someone whose name we will never know somewhere in the ancient world, a very long time ago. So let us begin there, at the very beginning, in a rocky desert in what is now the country of Jordan. Close your eyes if you would like to, or leave them open and unfocused, letting the light blur and soften. Either way, let the words carry you gently backward through time. There is no hurry. There is nowhere else you need to be. For a long time, the story of bread was told in a simple, straightforward way. Historians believed that humans first learned to farm, and then, once they had a steady supply of grain, they figured out how to grind it and bake it into bread. It was a neat, logical sequence. First came agriculture, then came bread. But then, in the black desert of northeastern Jordan, at a site called Shubaika, archaeologists found something that quietly changed everything. In the stone fireplaces of ancient hunter-gatherers, people known as the Natufians, researchers discovered tiny charred crumbs. These crumbs were about 14,400 years old, and when they were analyzed under a microscope, they turned out to be bread. Specifically, they were the remains of flatbreads made from wild cereals. Now, let that settle in for a moment. 14,400 years. That is roughly 4,000 years before the invention of agriculture. These people were not farmers. They did not plant seeds in tidy rows or harvest fields of golden wheat. They were hunter-gatherers, wandering the landscape, collecting what the wild earth offered them. And yet, somehow, they were making bread. This discovery is quietly remarkable because it turns the old story on its head. Bread did not come after farming. Bread came first, and some researchers now believe that bread may have actually been the reason humans began to farm in the first place. Think about what that means. The desire for bread, for this transformed, cooked, deeply satisfying food, may have been so powerful that it drove our ancestors to do something no human had ever done before. To stop wandering. To choose a place and stay there. To clear the ground, plant seeds, tend them through the seasons, and wait. All of that effort, all of that patience, all of that radical change in the way people lived, possibly motivated by the simple desire to eat bread more often, more reliably, without having to spend days searching the wild landscape for scattered handfuls of grain. If this theory is correct, then bread did not just come before agriculture. Bread may have caused agriculture. And agriculture, as we know, changed everything. The bread those Natufian people made was not like the bread you might be imagining. It was a rough flatbread made from a mixture of wild einkorn wheat, wild barley, oats, and the ground-up tubers of an aquatic plant called club rush. The inclusion of those tubers is a lovely detail because it tells us that this was not a simple recipe. Those roots are fibrous and tough. To make them edible, you would need to dry them, grind them, and likely roast them before mixing them into your dough. This was a multi-step process, a genuine piece of food engineering carried out by people we sometimes imagine as living the simplest of lives. And the labor involved in making that bread was enormous. Think about it for a moment. There were no machines, no mills, no draft animals to help. Every single calorie in that flatbread was the product of intense human effort. First, the wild grasses had to be gathered. Wild grain is tricky because the seed heads shatter easily, scattering their seeds on the ground. You have to harvest them at just the right moment, using a careful sweeping motion with a flint-bladed sickle. Then, the grain had to be dehusked. Each tiny kernel was wrapped in a tough outer shell, and removing it required pounding the grain in a stone mortar or parching it over a fire to make the husk brittle enough to crack away. And then came the grinding. The primary tool was the saddle quern, a large, concave stone. You would place the grain on this stone and push a smaller handstone back and forth, crushing the kernels into a rough flour. Bioarchaeological evidence, the study of ancient human bones, tells us just how physically demanding this was. The skeletons of women from this period show distinctive patterns of wear on their toes, knees, and lower spines, the result of spending hours every day kneeling and rocking back and forth over the grinding stone. All of this labor just for a single meal of flatbread. Take a moment to appreciate that. Imagine the hours of gathering, the hours of pounding and dehusking, the hours of grinding, and then the mixing, the shaping, and the baking over hot stones or in the ashes of a fire. An entire day's work. Perhaps more, for a few rounds of rough flatbread. In an era when every calorie counted, when survival was never guaranteed, the decision to invest so much energy in producing bread tells us something profound about how much these people valued it. This suggests that early bread was not a casual, everyday food. It was probably more like a feast food, something prepared for special occasions, for ritual gatherings, for communal meals that brought people together around a fire. The act of making bread together and then eating it together was itself a social bond. Bread was a form of community long before it became a daily staple. And perhaps that is why we still break bread with one another today. There is something ancient in that gesture, something that reaches back 14,000 years to a time when sharing bread meant sharing labor, sharing trust, sharing life. And here is another thought to drift off with. There is a long-running debate among anthropologists about whether humans first domesticated grain for the purpose of making bread or for the purpose of making beer. It is one of those quiet academic arguments that has been simmering since the 1950s. The case for beer is interesting. Fermentation sterilizes water, making it safer to drink. And beer provides a pleasant, psychoactive reward, which would have been a powerful motivator in social and ritual settings. The case for bread is equally compelling. Bread is dense, portable, and stores better than raw grain, which can sprout or rot. The evidence from Shubaika suggests that solid grain products, bread and its relatives, have a very deep history. But at another site, the Reykjavik cave in Israel, evidence of beer brewing from wild grains dates back 13,000 years. So the two technologies are almost exactly the same age. The truth is probably the simplest answer. Bread and beer grew up together. They are, after all, chemically cousins. Beer is essentially liquid bread. The same ingredients, the same grains, the same yeasts, just processed differently. One is solid and dry, The other is liquid and effervescent, but they spring from the same source. And in ancient Sumer, as we will discover shortly, they were quite literally inseparable, two sides of the same barley kernel. But let us not rush ahead. Let us linger here a moment longer, in the quiet of that ancient desert, beside the stone hearth where those first flatbreads were made. Imagine the scene. A small group of people gathered around a fire as the desert sky darkens overhead. The stars are beginning to appear, and someone is kneeling at a flat stone, grinding grain into a rough paste. The smell of roasting tubers drifts through the cool evening air. Somewhere nearby, a child is sleeping, and in the embers of the fire, a flatbread is baking, slowly, patiently, turning golden in the heat. This is where it all begins. From this small, quiet moment beside a fire, the entire story of civilization will unfold. And so we move on, forward in time by many thousands of years, to a place where rivers run through flat, fertile plains, and where the first true cities are rising from the mud. We are in Mesopotamia now, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates in what is today Iraq. This is where the Sumerians built some of the earliest cities the world has ever known. And the foundation of everything they built, every temple, every palace, every great wall, was grain, specifically barley. And from barley, they made bread and beer. The Sumerians developed the oldest known writing system in the world, cuneiform, those little wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay tablets with a reed stylus. And here is a detail that is worth pausing on, because it says something profound about the priorities of early civilization. This writing system did not emerge to record poetry or philosophy or love letters. It emerged, largely, to keep track of grain. How much barley came in from the farms? How much bread went out to the workers? How many rations were distributed to how many people? The earliest documents in human history are not songs or stories. They are receipts. They are inventory lists. They are the accounting records of a bread-based economy. Writing itself is, in a sense, a byproduct of bread. We learned to write because we needed to count our loaves. The connection between bread and beer in Sumer was beautifully expressed in a poem called the Hymn to Ninkasi. Ninkasi was the Sumerian goddess of beer, and the hymn, which dates to about 1800 years before the Common Era, is not just a prayer, it is a recipe. It describes the process of baking a special barley bread called bapir in a pit oven, then soaking this bread in water with malt and honey, and allowing the mixture to ferment in a large vat. The bread was the raw material for the beer. It was likely baked twice, to dry it out and preserve it, much like a modern biscuit or rusk. This meant you could store your bread and, whenever you were ready, dissolve it in water and let it become beer. The Sumerian state ran on a system of redistribution. Temple bureaucrats collected grain from farmers and then handed it back out as rations to the laborers and officials who kept the city running. Archaeologists have found thousands upon thousands of crude, mass-produced clay bowls at Sumerian sites. These are called beveled rim bowls, and they are believed to be the standard measure for a daily ration of barley or bread. Each bowl was roughly the same size, each held roughly the same amount. It was an early form of standardization, of turning bread into a unit of payment. Imagine that for a moment. Your daily wage, not in coins, not in precious metals, but in bread. You would wake up, go to the temple or the workshop, perform your labor, and at the end of the day you would receive your portion of bread and beer. That was your pay. That was the economy. And if you were a high official, you received more bread, which you could trade for cloth, for pottery, for copper tools, for anything else you might need. In this world, wealth was measured in loaves. There is something both simple and profound about an economy built entirely on bread. It reminds us that before all the abstractions of modern finance, before stocks and currencies and digital transactions, the fundamental economic question was always the same. Do the people have enough to eat? Now, let us travel further down the length of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and then westward along the coast to the banks of another great river, the Nile. We are in Egypt now, and this is where the story of bread takes a rather significant turn. If Mesopotamia was the land where bread and beer were intertwined, Egypt was the land where bread baking became a true art form and a massive industry. The Nile flooded predictably every year, depositing rich black silt across the valley floor, making the soil extraordinarily fertile. The Egyptians grew emmer, wheat, and barley in abundance, and bread formed the vast majority of their diet. But the Egyptian contribution to the history of bread goes far beyond simply growing more grain. The Egyptians are credited with mastering the art of leavened bread around 3,000 years before the Common Era. Let me explain what that means, because it is one of the most important moments in the entire history of food. Up until this point, for thousands and thousands of years, bread was flat. It was dense. It was a cracker or a pancake, not a loaf. But somewhere in the warm Egyptian air, something changed. Picture a bowl of flour and water mixed together and left sitting on a stone counter in the Egyptian heat. In that warm, moist environment, invisible organisms, wild yeasts and bacteria floating in the air or clinging to the surface of the grain itself, would begin to colonize the mixture. They would feed on the sugars in the flour, producing carbon dioxide gas and lactic acid. The gas would form tiny bubbles in the dough, causing it to rise, to puff up, to become lighter and airier. Now, if a baker noticed this and, instead of throwing away the bubbly, sour-smelling dough, decided to bake it anyway, the result would have been a revelation. A loaf that was soft, open-textured, tangy, and far more pleasant to eat than the dense flatbreads of before. And if that baker had the further insight to save a piece of this living, fermented dough, this starter, this mother, and mix it into the next day's batch of fresh flour and water, then the entire new batch would rise as well. This is the origin of sourdough. It is the oldest form of leavened bread in the world, and it was born in Egypt. There is another theory too about how the Egyptians leavened their bread. Since they were also avid brewers, they may have scooped the foam from the top of their fermenting beer vats, the yeasty froth called balm, and mixed it directly into their dough. This would have produced an even lighter, fluffier loaf. However it happened, the result was transformative. The flat, dense breads of the past 10,000 years were suddenly joined by something entirely new, a bread that was light, that had an interior full of tiny air pockets, that was soft to the touch and pleasant to chew. It was a different food altogether, and it captured the Egyptian imagination. Egyptian bakeries became factories. In the tomb of Tai from the 5th dynasty, there are detailed stone carvings showing the entire baking process in careful detail. We can see men trampling dough in large vats with their feet to knead it, a vigorous and slightly unsettling method, their weight and motion working the gluten in the wheat until it became smooth and elastic. We can see other workers shaping the dough into loaves, placing them into molds, and loading them into ovens. These carvings are, in effect, the world's oldest baking manual, preserved in stone for over 4,000 years. The Egyptians baked over 40 distinct varieties of bread. There were sour breads, and there were enriched breads made with honey, dates, figs, and milk. There were conical loaves baked in heated clay molds, braided loaves, and loaves shaped like animals like geese and cows, specifically for ritual offerings to the gods. And here is another quietly remarkable detail. Egypt functioned for much of its long history without coinage. The economy ran on what historians call a bread and beer standard. Consider the Great Pyramids at Giza. The workforce that built those monuments was not composed of slaves. as is often imagined. They were paid laborers, and their daily wage consisted of specific quantities of bread and beer. A standard ration might be 10 loaves and 2 jugs of beer per day, with higher status overseers receiving hundreds of loaves, which they could then trade for other goods. Bread was money. And bread was not just for the living. The Egyptians believed that the soul needed sustenance in the afterlife, and so they placed real loaves of bread in the tombs of the dead, alongside jars of beer and other provisions, to nourish the deceased on their journey through the underworld. These loaves, desiccated by the dry desert air, have survived for thousands of years, and archaeologists can still identify the grain structure within them. Let that image settle in your mind as you rest. A loaf of bread, placed gently beside a body 4,000 years ago, still there, still recognizable, still telling its story to anyone who cares to look. There is something tender about that practice, something that speaks to the deepest human instincts. Even in death, you would not be left hungry. Even on the long, uncertain journey to whatever comes next, you would have bread. The people who loved you made sure of that. And so Egypt gave the world 2 gifts that would echo through the millennia. The first was leavened bread itself, the living, rising, breathing loaf that is still the most common form of bread on earth. The second was the idea that bread is more than sustenance, that it is comfort and care and a promise that you will not be abandoned. Whether you are a laborer building a pyramid or a soul traveling through the underworld, someone has thought of you. Someone has set aside a loaf. Let your own breathing slow now, if it has not already. We are in no hurry. The story moves at its own pace, like the Nile flooding gently over its banks. Let us travel now to the shores of the Mediterranean, to the rocky hills and sun-drenched islands of ancient Greece, and then to the vast, ambitious empire of Rome. The Greeks refined the technology of baking in important ways. While the Egyptians used top-loading ovens and heated molds, the Greeks developed the front-loading, freestanding oven, a design they called the hypnos. This is the ancestor of the modern pizza oven and the wood-fired bread oven. It allowed for greater heat retention and produced crusty hearth-style loaves with a character quite different from the Egyptian mold-baked bread. But what is particularly interesting about bread in Greece is the social divide it revealed. The rocky, mountainous soil of Greece was better suited for growing barley than wheat. And barley, unlike wheat, has very little gluten. It does not rise well. You cannot make a light, airy loaf from barley. So there were 2 staple foods in ancient Greece, and the one you ate said a great deal about who you were. The common food, the food of the masses, was called masa. It was a barley cake or porridge, dense and heavy, often eaten with figs or cheese. It was considered a simple, rustic, honest food. Then there was artos, leavened wheat bread. Wheat was expensive in Greece. It often had to be imported from the Black Sea region or from Sicily. White wheat bread was a luxury, a sign of wealth, urbanity, and refinement. If you ate artos, you were doing well. If you ate masa, you were getting by. The Greeks also baked specific breads for their gods. For Artemis, the goddess of the moon and the hunt, they baked moon-shaped cakes. For Demeter, the goddess of grain and the harvest, they baked loaves shaped like farm tools or symbols of fertility as offerings to ensure a good crop. And so we come to Rome. And with Rome, the story of bread grows louder, larger, and more political than anything that has come before. The Romans inherited much of their baking knowledge from the Greeks, often quite literally, by conquering Greek territories and bringing Greek bakers back to Rome as captives and servants in the 2nd century before the Common Era. And they scaled everything up to imperial proportions. The Romans were not great inventors, but they were extraordinary organizers. They took what others had created and built systems around it, vast, efficient, relentless systems. In Rome, Bread became something more than food or even money. It became a tool of statecraft, a weapon of political control, and the very foundation of the relationship between the emperor and his people. By the height of its power, the city of Rome had a population of over 1 million people. That is a staggering number for the ancient world. The local farmland could not possibly feed so many mouths. So Rome became dependent, utterly dependent on grain imported from its conquered provinces, especially the breadbaskets of North Africa and Egypt. A massive fleet of grain ships shuttled wheat across the Mediterranean to the port of Ostia, where it was loaded onto barges and towed up the Tiber to the city. The state organized and guaranteed this supply because the alternative was unthinkable. If the grain ships did not arrive, the people would riot and the emperor would fall. This system was called the cura annonnae, the grain dole, and it evolved over time. At first, the state sold grain to citizens at a subsidized below-market price. Later, under political pressure, it began distributing grain for free, and eventually, in the 3rd century, the state started distributing not just raw grain but finished baked bread, along with olive oil and pork. Think about that progression for a moment. What began as a subsidy, a way to keep grain affordable, became a free handout, and then became a fully prepared meal delivered by the state. The Roman government was, in effect, running the largest bread delivery service the ancient world had ever seen. And it did so because the alternative, a hungry and angry populace, was the one thing no emperor could survive. This arrangement led the Roman satirist Juvenal to make one of the most famous observations in all of political history. He wrote that the Roman people, who had once commanded armies and elected magistrates, now longed for only 2 things: bread and circuses. It is a phrase that echoes across the centuries, and it carries a warning that still applies today. Give the people food and entertainment, and they will tolerate almost anything. Take away the food, and no amount of spectacle will save you. Meanwhile, far away from the political intrigues of Rome, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79 froze one Roman city in time. In the ruins of Pompeii, archaeologists have found bakeries preserved in extraordinary detail. The Roman bakery, the Pistrina, was an industrial operation. Large hourglass-shaped mills made of volcanic stone were turned by donkeys or by enslaved people grinding grain into flour all day long. The friction of stone on stone inevitably ground tiny particles of grit into the flour, and this grit, consumed in every loaf, slowly wore down the teeth of the Roman population over a lifetime. The iconic bread of Pompeii is the panis quadratus, a round sourdough wheel scored into 8 wedges so that it could be easily torn and shared. Some of these loaves have survived to this day, carbonized by the volcanic heat, but still perfectly recognizable as bread. You can see them in museums, these 2,000-year-old loaves, black and hardened, but still bearing the marks of the baker's hands, still showing the 8 scored lines where they were meant to be divided. Some of these loaves have a horizontal groove running around their circumference, suggesting that a string was tied around them during baking or for carrying them home from the bakery. You can imagine a Roman citizen walking through the streets of Pompeii, a loaf of bread dangling from a loop of string, freshly bought from the bakery on the corner, not knowing that in a matter of hours, the mountain above the city would erupt and preserve that loaf, and that bakery, and that entire way of life for millennia. And Roman bread was often stamped. Bronze or clay stamps were pressed into the surface of the loaf before baking, marking the name or symbol of the baker. This was not decoration. It was regulation. If a loaf was found to be underweight or adulterated with cheap fillers, the authorities could trace the stamp back to the baker responsible and punish them. The Romans also codified, in their characteristically orderly fashion, the class structure of bread. There was panis candidus, the whitest bread, made from the finest, most carefully sifted flour and reserved for the wealthy. There was panis secundus, a whole wheat bread with some bran left in, eaten by the middle class. And there was panis plebeius, sometimes called panis sordidus, a dark, coarse loaf made from bran, mixed grains, and sometimes ground legumes eaten by the poor and by enslaved people. There was also panis castrensis, the soldier's bread, designed to last through the long campaigns of the Roman legions. It was hard, dense, durable, the kind of bread you could carry in your pack for days without it crumbling or spoiling. Armies marched on bread. Empires expanded on bread. Without a reliable supply of grain and the ability to turn it into portable, long-lasting loaves, the Roman legions could not have conquered the world as they did. Your bread told the world exactly where you stood. The color of your loaf was the color of your class. And this pattern, white bread for the rich, dark bread for the poor, would persist across Europe and beyond for the next 2,000 years. It is one of the most enduring social divisions in all of human history, and as we will see, it would eventually, and rather ironically, reverse itself entirely. But let us return now to a quieter, slower time, to the long centuries of the Middle Ages, when the great Roman roads crumbled and the empire faded, and life in Europe contracted into small villages clustered around castles and churches. In medieval Europe, the infrastructure of bread production was tightly controlled by the feudal system. The lord of the manor did not just own the land, he owned the tools of production. Peasants were often legally required to grind their grain at the lord's mill, paying a portion of their grain, called a multure, as a tax for the privilege. If you tried to grind your own grain at home using a simple hand mill called a quern, you could be punished. Querns were frequently confiscated and destroyed because every kernel of grain ground privately was a kernel that escaped the lord's tax. This arrangement made the miller a figure of deep suspicion and resentment in medieval life. He was the middleman who stood between the farmer and his flour, and everyone suspected him of skimming more than his fair share. The miller appears in folklore and literature as a sly, dishonest character, most memorably in the works of Geoffrey Chaucer, where the miller is a burly, crude fellow who steals grain and charges extra for his grinding. Similarly, many villages had a communal oven called a four banal, where peasants brought their shaped dough to be baked, paying a fee for the use of the oven. Building and maintaining a proper bread oven was expensive, and the lord claimed the exclusive right to provide one. If you tried to bake your own bread in a makeshift oven at home, you could be fined or punished. So consider the life of a medieval peasant who wanted to eat bread. You grew the grain in the lord's fields, paying a portion of the harvest as rent. You ground the grain at the lord's mill, paying a multure for the privilege. You shaped the dough at home in the one space that was truly your own, and then you carried your shaped loaves to the lord's oven, paying yet another fee to bake them. At every single step in the process, from field to loaf, someone else took a cut. Bread was not just sustenance in the medieval world. It was a system of control, a way of extracting wealth from the labor of the poor, one loaf at a time. In 1266, King Henry III of England took a step that would echo through the centuries. He issued the Assize of Bread and Ale, one of the first consumer protection laws in history. This was a law that regulated the price and quality of bread. The mechanism was rather elegant. The price of a loaf of bread was fixed, say at 1 penny, but the size and weight of that penny loaf fluctuated with the market price of wheat. When wheat was cheap and plentiful, your penny bought you a large, heavy loaf. When wheat was expensive and scarce, your penny bought you a smaller, lighter loaf. The price stayed the same, but the loaf grew and shrank. The penalties for cheating were public and humiliating. A baker caught selling underweight or adulterated bread might be dragged through the streets on a wooden frame called a hurdle, with the offending loaf tied around his neck for everyone to see. It was a powerful deterrent, and this fear of accidental punishment gave rise to a custom that survives to this day, though most people have forgotten its origin. To make absolutely sure they were not accidentally giving a customer less bread than the law required, bakers began adding an extra loaf to every order of 12, 13 loaves for the price of 12, a margin of error in the customer's favor. It was a form of insurance built into every sale. This is the origin of the phrase we still use today, the baker's dozen. The next time you hear those words, you can picture a medieval baker in his flour-dusted apron, nervously counting his loaves one more time, making sure that 13th roll is there, because the alternative, the humiliation of being dragged through the streets with a bad loaf around his neck, was simply not worth the risk. Now, there is something else worth knowing about bread in the Middle Ages, something that connects to the way people ate their meals. In medieval dining plates, as we know them, were rare, at least for ordinary people. Instead, diners used what was called a trencher. A trencher was a thick slab of stale, coarse bread, usually made from rye or wholemeal flour, cut flat and placed on the table in front of each diner. Meats and sauces were served directly onto the trencher. The bread absorbed the grease and the juices, acting as both plate and sponge. At the end of the meal, the sauce-soaked trencher was itself a kind of delicacy. If you were still hungry, you ate it. If you were a wealthy host, you might pass your trencher to a servant. And if you were feeling generous, you might toss your bread to the dogs or give it to the poor waiting outside as a form of charity. It is a lovely detail, is it not? Your plate was your bread, and your bread was your final course. And in a society where waste was unthinkable, where every scrap of food had value, the trencher ensured that nothing was lost. The juices and the flavors of the meal soaked into the bread, transforming it from a piece of tableware into a final savory treat. In wealthier households, the used trenchers were collected and distributed to the poor who gathered outside the door after a feast, waiting for the bread that had served as the plates of their betters. In this way, the trencher was also a quiet form of charity, a way of feeding those who could not feed themselves. But there was a darker side to bread in the Middle Ages, and it came from rye. In Northern Europe, where wheat was difficult to grow, rye was the dominant grain. Rye bread was the daily staple of millions of people. But rye has a vulnerability. It is susceptible to a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, commonly known as ergot. Ergot thrives in cool, damp conditions, and it infects the grain in the field, replacing the kernels with dark, purplish growths that contain powerful toxic alkaloids. When infected rye was harvested, milled, and baked into bread, the toxins survived the process. And when people ate this bread, they developed a condition called ergotism. The symptoms were horrifying: a burning sensation in the limbs, so painful that it was known as St. Anthony's fire, followed by hallucinations, convulsions, and in severe cases, gangrene that could cause fingers, toes, and even entire limbs to blacken and fall off. Entire villages could be affected at once, and the mass hallucinations and convulsions were sometimes interpreted as demonic possession or witchcraft. It is a chilling thought that some of the darkest episodes of medieval hysteria may have been caused, at least in part, by contaminated bread. Let us sit with that quietly for a moment. The same food that sustained life could, under the wrong conditions, bring suffering on a terrible scale. Bread is woven into both the best and the worst of human experience. The ergot alkaloids, it is worth noting, are chemical relatives of a substance that would become well known in the 20th century, lysergic acid diethylamide, commonly known as LSD. The hallucinations experienced by medieval villagers who ate contaminated bread were, in a very real chemical sense, a form of accidental intoxication. Some historians have even suggested that certain episodes of mass hysteria and reported witchcraft in medieval and early modern Europe may have been outbreaks of ergotism in disguise. The accused were not possessed by demons, they were poisoned by their bread. It is a haunting thought to carry with you as you rest, but also a reminder of how deeply intertwined the story of bread is with the story of human suffering and misunderstanding. Not every chapter of this story is gentle, but understanding the difficult parts helps us appreciate the whole. Now, let us cross an ocean. Let us travel to the year 1492 and the event that would reshape the diets of the entire world. When European ships reached the Americas, they set in motion a massive exchange of crops, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the New. Historians call this the Columbian Exchange, and its consequences for the story of bread were profound. In Mesoamerica, the indigenous peoples had their own form of bread, made not from wheat, but from maize, which we also call corn. The tortilla was the staff of life in Mexico and Central America, just as the wheat loaf was in Europe and the rice cake was in East Asia. It was ground, shaped, cooked on a hot stone or clay griddle, and eaten with nearly every meal. It was the foundation of a great and sophisticated cuisine, the basis of an entire civilization. But the preparation of maize involved a crucial step that European observers failed to understand. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had developed a chemical process called nixtamalization. They soaked their corn kernels in an alkaline solution, water mixed with limestone powder or wood ash, before grinding them into dough. This might seem like a minor detail, a quirk of cooking technique, but it was in fact a matter of life and death. The alkaline treatment did several important things. It dissolved the tough outer hull of the corn kernel, making it easier to grind. It allowed the corn proteins to form a pliable dough called masa. And most critically, it made a vital nutrient, niacin or vitamin B3, chemically available for the human body to absorb. Without nixtamalization, the niacin in corn is locked up in a form the body cannot use. And without niacin, a person who depends on corn for most of their calories will develop a devastating disease called pellagra. When Europeans brought corn back to the Old World, they embraced the grain enthusiastically. It grew abundantly and cheaply. But they ignored the alkaline treatment, dismissing it as a primitive and unnecessary step. The result was a slow-moving catastrophe. In Italy, where poor communities came to depend on polenta made from untreated cornmeal, pellagra became endemic. In Spain, in parts of Africa, and later in the American South, wherever corn became the dietary staple of impoverished populations, pellagra followed. The disease was characterized by what doctors called the 4 Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. It took centuries, well into the 20th century, before scientists finally understood the chemical connection between corn processing and pellagra. All that suffering, because the knowledge of indigenous cooks was overlooked and dismissed. It is a sobering lesson about the arrogance of assuming that unfamiliar methods have nothing to teach us. Meanwhile, the exchange worked in the other direction as well. Europeans brought wheat to the Americas. It was first planted by Spanish missionaries, in part because Catholic doctrine required wheaten bread for the celebration of the Eucharist. You could not consecrate a tortilla. You needed proper wheat bread. Wheat struggled in tropical climates, but it thrived in the temperate zones of North America and in the vast grasslands of the Argentine pampas. Over time, these regions would become the breadbaskets of the modern world, exporting wheat on a scale that the ancient Egyptians could never have imagined. The Columbian Exchange reminds us that the story of bread is not just a story of invention and progress. It is also a story of collision, of misunderstanding, of the consequences that follow when one culture's knowledge is dismissed by another. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had spent thousands of years developing a sophisticated understanding of how to process their staple grain safely. When that knowledge was ignored, The result was centuries of preventable disease. It is a humbling reminder that wisdom does not always travel with the grain. Let us pause here for a breath. Feel the rise and fall of your chest. The story continues, and we have more ground to cover, but there is no rush. Each breath is its own small journey. And so we come to the wide world of bread traditions, each one shaped by the particular geography, climate, and culture of the people who bake it. Let us wander slowly through a few of them. In northern China, wheat has been a staple for thousands of years, but the landscape presented a practical problem. Fuel was scarce. Wood and other burnable materials were not always easy to come by, and ovens, which need to reach and maintain high temperatures, were fuel-hungry. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of baking bread in a hot oven, the Chinese steamed it. Steaming uses less fuel than baking. It produces a different kind of bread entirely, moist, soft, fluffy, and white, rather than crusty and brown. The steamed bun, known as mantou, became the staple bread of the north. And like all great foods, mantou has its legend. The origin story is attributed to the brilliant military strategist Zhuge Liang, who lived during the turbulent Three Kingdoms period, around the 3rd century. According to the tale, Zhuge Liang needed to cross a turbulent river with his army, and a local deity demanded the sacrifice of 50 human heads as the price of safe passage. Unwilling to kill his own soldiers, Zhuge Liang ordered his cooks to make dough, shape it into the likeness of human heads, stuff the dough with meat, and steam them. He then cast these imitation heads into the river to satisfy the deity. The ruse worked, and the army crossed safely. These deceptive dough heads were called mantou, meaning something like barbarian heads, and they became the ancestors of the steamed buns that are still eaten across China today. Over time, the filled version of the bun came to be known as baozi, while the plain, unfilled bun kept the name mantou. Today, mantou remains a staple across northern China, eaten at nearly every meal, plain and white and soft, a canvas for whatever accompanies it. It is bread stripped down to its most essential form, nothing but flour, water, and yeast, transformed by steam into something pillowy and comforting. There is a quiet beauty to steamed bread that is quite different from the beauty of a crusty, oven-baked loaf. Where a baguette crackles and shatters, a mantou yields and gives. Where a sourdough boule is rustic and assertive, a mantou is smooth and humble. Both are bread. Both are nourishing. But they reflect two very different philosophies of cooking, shaped by two very different landscapes. Now, let us travel south and west to the Indian subcontinent, where bread culture is divided along lines of both technology and social status. The defining piece of bread technology in South Asian cooking is the tandoor, a cylindrical clay oven heated by a charcoal fire burning at the bottom. The tandoor reached India through Persia and Central Asia, and it can reach extraordinary temperatures up to 480 degrees Celsius or about 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Flatbread is slapped against the inner walls of the oven, where it bakes in minutes, puffing up and developing charred spots. The bread most associated with the tandoor is naan, a leavened bread made from refined white flour. Naan was historically a high-status food. It was the bread of the Mughal court, requiring both expensive white flour and a specialized oven that most households did not possess. To eat naan was, in a sense, to eat luxury. The daily bread of the masses, on the other hand, was roti, or chapati, an unleavened bread made from stone-ground whole wheat flour, cooked on a simple iron griddle called a tava. A tava is cheap, portable, and requires no special fuel or infrastructure. Anyone can make roti. Not everyone could make naan. This distinction between naan and roti mirrors the white bread versus brown bread divide that we have seen in so many other cultures, from Egypt to Rome to medieval England. But in India, It was defined as much by technology, the oven versus the griddle, as by the grain itself. The tandoor was a piece of infrastructure. It required space, fuel, and maintenance. A tava, on the other hand, could sit in any kitchen, over any fire, and produce bread in minutes. Even today, in homes across South Asia, the gentle sound of roti being shaped between the palms, the soft slap of dough against the tava, and the sight of it puffing up over an open flame are among the most universal and comforting rituals of daily life. It is bread at its most intimate, made fresh for each meal, eaten warm from the griddle, torn by hand rather than cut with a knife. Now let us travel further north, to Russia and the Slavic world, where bread carries a weight of meaning that goes beyond the nutritional. In Russian and Slavic cultures, bread is deeply sacred. The ceremony of bread and salt, called chleb-sol, is the highest expression of hospitality. When guests arrive, they are welcomed with a large, round, beautifully decorated loaf called a korovai, placed on an embroidered towel with a small cellar of salt resting on top. The guest is expected to tear a piece of bread from the loaf, dip it in the salt, and eat it. This act establishes a bond of friendship and trust that is considered unbreakable. Bread represents the wealth and bounty of the earth, while salt represents protection, both from decay and from evil. To share bread and salt with someone is to say, in effect, we are connected now. There is a particular bread from this tradition that has a story worth telling. Borodinsky bread is a dark, dense Russian rye loaf, flavored with coriander seeds. According to legend, it was created by the widow of a general who was killed at the Battle of Borodino in 1812, the great and terrible battle of Napoleon's invasion of Russia. The widow entered a convent and devoted herself to baking this dark, solemn bread. The darkness of the loaf symbolized her mourning, and the coriander seeds were said to represent the grape shot that killed her husband. Whether or not the legend is true, and legends rarely need to be true to carry meaning, Borodinsky bread remains a beloved staple in Russia, heavy and dark and aromatic, the kind of bread that feels like it carries the weight of history in every slice. If you were to hold a piece of it in your hand, you would notice its density, its earthiness, the warm scent of coriander rising from the crust. It is bread that does not pretend to be delicate or refined. It is bread that has survived winters. And finally, let us visit Japan, where bread has a rather unexpected origin story. Bread was entirely unknown in Japan until 1543. When Portuguese missionaries arrived on its shores. The Japanese word for bread, pan, is a direct borrowing from the Portuguese word for bread, pau. For centuries after the Portuguese introduction, bread remained a foreign curiosity in Japan, something associated with outsiders and Christianity. It did not fit into the rice-centered cuisine that defined Japanese food culture. It was not until the Meiji era, in the late 19th century, that bread finally found its place in Japan. And it happened through an act of cultural fusion. A baker created anpan, a soft wheat bun filled with sweet red bean paste, called anko. This was a stroke of genius, taking the Western form, a round bread roll, and filling it with one of the most traditional and beloved Japanese flavors. Anpan bridged the gap between the foreign and the familiar, and from that point on, bread began its slow integration into Japanese life. Today, Japan has one of the most creative and diverse bread cultures in the world, with bakeries producing everything from milk bread, which is legendarily soft and pillowy, to curry-filled donuts and melon-shaped sweet buns. What began as a foreign import has been thoroughly absorbed and reimagined, made unmistakably Japanese in the process. Each of these traditions, the steamed buns of China, the tandoor breads of India, the sacred loaves of Russia, the adapted buns of Japan, tells us the same thing in a different accent. Bread is universal, but it is never generic. Every culture shapes it according to its own needs, its own climate, its own values, its own stories. And in every case, bread becomes more than the sum of its ingredients. It becomes a carrier of meaning, a vessel for identity, a way of saying, this is who we are, this is where we come from, this is what we hold dear. If you were to travel the world with nothing but a curiosity about bread, you would learn nearly everything there is to know about the people you met. Their geography would be revealed in their grain. Their technology would be revealed in their oven or their griddle or their steamer. Their values would be revealed in the rituals surrounding the loaf. Bread is a language spoken in every country on earth, and although the dialects vary, the message is always the same. We take what the earth gives us and we transform it into something that sustains us. And now let us turn to the great upheavals of the 19th century, when the ancient craft of bread making was transformed, in the span of a few decades, by the relentless advance of industrial technology. If the story of bread up to this point has been a slow, patient journey measured in millennia, what happens next unfolds with startling speed. In less than 100 years, 3 inventions will change bread more profoundly than the previous 10,000 years of human history combined. For 10,000 years, grain had been ground between stones. The saddle quern of the Natufians, the rotary hand mill of the Romans, the great water-powered millstones of the Middle Ages, they all worked on the same basic principle. You crushed the grain between 2 hard surfaces and out came flour. But stone grinding had a fundamental limitation. When you crush a wheat kernel, you crush everything: the white, starchy endosperm at the center, the fibrous bran coating on the outside, and the oily germ at the core. Even with careful sifting through progressively finer cloth sieves, stone-ground flour was never perfectly white. It always retained traces of bran and germ. And the oils in the germ meant that flour had a relatively short shelf life before it turned rancid. Then, in the 1870s, engineers in Hungary and Switzerland perfected a new technology, the steel roller mill. It was one of those inventions that seems purely mechanical, purely technical, the kind of thing you might read about in an engineering textbook and quickly forget. But its impact on the world was enormous. It changed not just how bread was made, but who could afford to eat it, what it tasted like, how long it lasted, and even how healthy the people who ate it were. It changed everything. Instead of crushing the grain between flat surfaces, the steel roller mill used pairs of fluted steel cylinders, spinning at different speeds, to shear the grain open. This was a fundamentally different action. It did not smash the kernel. It pulled it apart, cleanly separating the white endosperm from the bran and germ. The result was flour that was pristine white, with an almost indefinite shelf life, and it could be produced in enormous quantities at very low cost. White bread, which had been the exclusive luxury of aristocrats and the wealthy for millennia, the panis candidus of ancient Rome, the fine wheat loaves of the Mughal court, suddenly became the cheapest bread available to the urban working class. But this transformation came at a cost that was not immediately understood. By removing the bran and the germ, the roller mill also removed the vast majority of the iron, the B vitamins, and the fiber that whole grain naturally contains. White flour was beautiful and long-lasting, but it was nutritionally hollow. Over time, as populations came to depend on this refined flour, public health declined, and governments were eventually forced to step in and mandate the enrichment of white flour with the very nutrients that milling had stripped away. Around the same time, in 1862, a British physician named Dr. John Dalglish invented a curious method of making bread without yeast. He mixed flour with carbonated water that had been charged with carbon dioxide gas under pressure, much like soda water. When the pressure was released, the gas expanded within the dough, aerating it instantly. This aerated bread process, as it was called, eliminated the long, unpredictable fermentation time required by traditional yeast. It also reduced the amount of human contact with the dough, which was considered more hygienic. The company Dalglish founded, the Aerated Bread Company, became a massive chain of tea shops across London, arguably one of the first major industrial food franchises. Though the aerated bread itself never fully displaced traditional yeast-leavened loaves, the company's tea rooms became a fixture of Victorian London. And then came Louis Pasteur, and with him the final piece of the puzzle. Until the middle of the 19th century, leavening was a biological mystery. Bakers knew that if you added the foam from beer vats, or if you kept a piece of old dough and mixed it into a new batch, the bread would rise. But nobody understood why. It was a craft of intuition and tradition, not science. In 1857, Pasteur published his groundbreaking work proving that fermentation was not a spontaneous chemical reaction, but the activity of living microorganisms, tiny, invisible fungi called yeasts. This was part of his broader germ theory, which would revolutionize medicine, but its impact on baking was equally profound. Once scientists understood that specific microorganisms caused fermentation, they could isolate individual strains of yeast, select the ones that performed best, and cultivate them in controlled conditions. By the late 19th century, companies like the Fleischmann brothers in the United States were selling compressed cakes of pure, reliable, standardized yeast. This was a revolution in the kitchen. For 10,000 years, bakers had managed a chaotic, unpredictable biological process, coaxing life from mysterious starters and temperamental balm. Every batch was different. Every day brought new variables: the temperature of the room, the humidity of the air, the mood, if you will, of the invisible organisms at work in the dough. Bakers developed intuition over years of practice, learning to read the bubbles in their starter, to feel the elasticity of their dough, to smell when the fermentation had reached just the right point. Now, with commercially produced yeast, all of that uncertainty disappeared. You could buy a predictable product in a neat package, add it to your dough, and know exactly what would happen. The bread would rise on schedule every time. Baking transformed from an art into a science, from a biological gamble into a chemical equation. This was undeniably a gain in reliability and efficiency, but it was also, in a quieter way, a loss. Something of the old mystery, the old intimacy between baker and dough, was set aside in favor of speed and consistency. We will return to this tension later because it is at the heart of the modern bread story. And so we arrive in the 20th century, and the story of bread takes one more dramatic turn. In 1961, at a research facility in the town of Chorleywood, in Hertfordshire, England, scientists from the British Baking Industries Research Association developed a new method of making bread. Their goal was practical, even mundane. British wheat is relatively low in protein compared to the hard wheat grown in North America, and it does not naturally produce the strong, elastic gluten network needed for a good, fluffy loaf. The question was whether technology could compensate for what nature had not provided. The answer was the Chorleywood bread process, and it fundamentally changed the bread that most people in the industrialized world eat every day. The key innovation was speed. Traditional bread making requires long fermentation, hours and hours during which the yeast slowly does its work, developing the gluten network, building complex flavors, and creating the texture and character that define a good loaf. It is a patient process. You mix the dough, you knead it, and then you wait. You wait for the yeast to do its quiet, invisible work, producing gas and acid and alcohol, transforming the dough from a dense, sticky mass into something alive and elastic and fragrant. This waiting, this patience, has been central to baking for thousands of years. The Chorleywood process replaced this slow, biological development with raw mechanical energy. High-speed mixers, spinning at tremendous velocity, pounded the dough for just a few minutes, forcing the gluten to develop almost instantaneously. To make this work, the process relied on a cocktail of chemical additives: ascorbic acid, which is vitamin C, served as an oxidizer to strengthen the gluten. Emulsifiers softened the crumb and extended shelf life. Preservatives prevented mold. Extra yeast and extra water were added to compensate for the shortened fermentation. The result was the modern supermarket loaf, the soft, squishy, pre-sliced bread that can be produced from raw flour to a sealed, wrapped package in under 4 hours. It is inexpensive, consistent, and incredibly long-lasting. It is the bread that fills the shelves of grocery stores around the world. But it is also the bread that has drawn the most criticism. Many bakers and food scientists have argued that the elimination of long fermentation comes at a cost. Traditional slow fermentation allows enzymes in the flour to break down phytates, compounds that block the absorption of minerals like zinc and iron. It also partially breaks down the gluten proteins, making them potentially easier to digest. The Chorleywood process skips all of this, producing bread that some believe contributes to the rise of modern wheat sensitivities and digestive discomfort. Whether or not this critique is fully justified is still a matter of scientific debate, and the truth, as it often does, likely lies somewhere in the nuanced middle. The Chorleywood process feeds millions of people affordably and reliably. That is not a small thing. In a world where hunger is still a reality for many, cheap bread is a genuine good. But it is also worth noting that in recent decades, there has been a growing movement back toward traditional methods, a return to sourdough, to long fermentation, to ancient grains and stone-ground flour. Small bakeries have reopened. Home bakers have revived sourdough starters, feeding them every day like small bubbly pets, nurturing the same living cultures that Egyptian bakers first discovered 5,000 years ago. It is as if, after a century of industrial bread, something in us is reaching back toward that older, slower way of doing things. Something in us remembers that bread was once alive and wants it to be alive again. Speaking of innovations that seem small but changed everything, let us pause for a moment on the invention of sliced bread. In 1928, a man named Otto Rohwedder unveiled a machine that could slice an entire loaf of bread into uniform pieces. Bakers were skeptical at first. They worried that sliced bread would go stale faster, since slicing exposed more surface area to the air. Rohwedder solved this problem by integrating a wrapping machine that sealed the sliced loaf immediately. The public loved it immediately. Sliced bread was convenient, uniform, and perfectly suited for the electric toaster, which was just becoming a common household appliance around the same time. The timing was fortunate, almost poetic. Two inventions, the slicer and the toaster, arrived in the same decade, and together they created an entirely new way of eating bread. It standardized the sandwich, making it the default meal of the American and British worker. And it embedded itself so deeply in the culture that it became the benchmark against which all future innovations would be measured. The greatest thing since sliced bread. It is a rather wonderful phrase when you think about it. The quiet suggestion that a sliced loaf of bread was so transformative that nothing since has quite measured up. And in a way, it captures something true about the relationship between bread and innovation. The most meaningful inventions are often the most ordinary ones. They do not announce themselves with fanfare. They simply slip into daily life and make it a little easier, a little more convenient, a little more comfortable, until we cannot imagine how we ever managed without them. A loaf of bread, pre-sliced and ready for the toaster. It seems so simple, but it changed the way millions of people ate breakfast, packed lunch, and thought about their daily meals. But let us return to something older and deeper now, as we begin to bring this story toward its close. Let us talk about bread and faith. Bread has not just fed the body, it has fed the soul. And in doing so, it has been at the center of some of the most profound and divisive moments in religious history. In 1054, the Christian church split in two. The Great Schism divided the Roman Catholic Church of the West from the Eastern Orthodox Church of the East, a division that has endured for nearly 1,000 years. The causes of this schism were many: theological, political, and personal. But among the most heated disputes was an argument about bread. The question was this: what kind of bread should be used in the Eucharist, the sacred ritual in which bread and wine are consecrated and consumed? The Western Church, based in Rome, used unleavened bread, flat wafers made without yeast. Their reasoning was that the Last Supper was a Passover meal, and during Passover, the Jewish tradition strictly forbids the use of leaven. Therefore, they argued, Jesus would have used unleavened bread, and the Church should do the same. The Eastern Church disagreed. They used leavened bread, risen bread, for the Eucharist. They argued that leavened bread, artos, symbolized the living Christ and the rising of the soul. To use flat, unleavened bread was, in their view, to serve a dead symbol, and they considered the Western practice to be excessively influenced by Jewish ritual. This disagreement, which might seem trivial from the outside, was anything but. It touched on the deepest questions of theology, the nature of Christ, the meaning of the sacrament, and the relationship between Christianity and its Jewish roots. And it contributed to a rupture that divided the Christian world for a millennium. Bread, which had always united people at the table, had divided an entire faith. The argument was about yeast, about whether a loaf should be flat or risen, but beneath that simple question lay centuries of accumulated theological tension, cultural identity, and political rivalry. It is a reminder that bread is never merely bread. It is always also a symbol, and symbols have the power to unite or to divide, depending on who is holding them and what they believe they mean. And in Judaism itself, bread carries a weight of symbolism that is difficult to overstate, most visibly during the festival of Passover. During Passover, Jewish families eat matzah, a flat, unleavened bread. Matzah commemorates the Exodus from Egypt, the moment when the Israelites fled slavery in such haste that their dough did not have time to rise. They carried the flat, unbaked dough on their backs and baked it in the sun as they walked toward freedom. What is particularly beautiful about matzah is that it symbolizes two seemingly contradictory things at the same time. It is called the bread of affliction, the bread of slavery and poverty and hardship, and yet it is also the bread of freedom, the bread that sustained the journey out of bondage. It holds both meanings simultaneously, the sorrow of where you have been and the hope of where you are going. Before Passover begins, Jewish families go through their homes and remove every trace of chametz, anything made with leaven. This is not just a dietary practice, it is a spiritual one. The removal of leaven from the home symbolizes the removal of arrogance, of puffed-up ego, of spiritual corruption. The flat, humble matzah is what remains when all pretension has been stripped away. It is a quiet and rather moving idea that a piece of bread can carry so much meaning, that a simple act, the removal of leaven, can become a metaphor for the removal of everything that is false and inflated in oneself. That, eating flat, humble bread, can be an act of spiritual practice, a way of remembering who you were, where you came from, and what truly matters. Across all the religions and traditions we have encountered tonight, bread has served as a bridge between the material and the spiritual, between the body and the soul. It is the most ordinary substance imaginable, flour and water and heat, and yet human beings have invested it with the deepest possible significance. It feeds us, yes, but it also reminds us of things we might otherwise forget: our obligations to one another, our gratitude for what the earth provides, our fragility, and our resilience. And now, let us bring our long journey to a close. We have traveled a very long way tonight, haven't we? From the stone hearths of the Natufians in the Jordan Desert, 14,000 years ago, all the way to the steel roller mills and high-speed mixers of the modern age. We have crossed deserts and oceans and centuries. We have watched bread change the shape of human life over and over again in ways both grand and intimate. We have seen how the simple desire to transform wild grass seeds into something edible may have driven the very invention of agriculture, the most consequential change in human history. We have seen how bread built the first cities and empires, from Sumer to Egypt, how it was the wage of the pyramid builders and the currency of the Nile. We have walked the streets of ancient Rome, where the color of your loaf announced your place in the world, and where emperors understood that the surest way to hold power was to keep the bread flowing. We have wandered the villages of medieval Europe, where the lord controlled the mill and the oven, and where a baker who cheated his customers was dragged through the streets with a loaf tied around his neck. We have crossed oceans. We have seen how the European failure to understand the indigenous preparation of corn led to centuries of needless suffering from pellagra. We have steamed buns in China and baked naan in the searing heat of an Indian tandoor. We have broken bread and dipped it in salt in a Russian home, sealing a bond of friendship that tradition says can never be broken. We have watched the quiet revolution of the roller mill, which turned white bread from a luxury into a commodity overnight, and the even quieter work of Louis Pasteur, who revealed that the rising of bread was the work of tiny living things. We have seen the modern supermarket loaf born in a laboratory in Chorleywood, and we have felt the pull of the artisan renaissance, the desire to go back to the old ways, to sourdough and slow fermentation and ancient grains. And through it all, a single thread connects everything. Bread is never just bread. It is a mirror of the society that bakes it. It reflects our technology and our values, our class divisions and our spiritual longings. The social hierarchy of bread, white for the rich, dark for the poor, persisted for over 2,000 years, and in one of history's most ironic reversals, has now flipped entirely. Today, it is the wealthy who seek out dark, rustic, artisanal sourdoughs, while the cheapest bread on the shelf is the whitest. And the politics of bread have not faded with time. From the Roman Annona to the bread riots of the French Revolution, from the bread queues of the Soviet Union to the protests of the Arab Spring, the price and availability of bread remains the ultimate barometer of a society's stability. The social contract between the people and their government is, at its most basic level, a promise of sustenance. When bread becomes too expensive, when it becomes scarce, when the people feel that the promise has been broken, then everything that follows is unpredictable. The queen who supposedly said, "Let them eat cake," lost her head for it, whether or not she actually spoke those words. The sentiment was enough. The perception that those in power did not understand or did not care about, the price of bread has toppled more governments than any army. As we look at the world tonight, we can see that the 14,000-year-old story of bread is far from over. In kitchens and bakeries around the world, people are reaching back across the millennia, reviving sourdough starters, experimenting with ancient grains like einkorn and emmer, embracing the long, slow fermentation that the Chorleywood process tried to eliminate. There is something deeply human about this impulse, a desire to reconnect with the oldest food tradition we have, to feel the dough in our hands, to wait patiently for it to rise, to smell it baking, and know that we are part of a lineage that stretches back to the very dawn of civilization. Bread remains, as it has always been, the staff of life, the quiet, humble foundation upon which everything else is built. It asks so little of us, just grain, just water, just heat, just time, and it gives us so much in return: nourishment, comfort, community, meaning. There is a reason that when we want to describe something as fundamental and essential, we call it our daily bread. There is a reason that when we want to describe the act of making peace with someone, we say that we break bread together. These phrases are not accidental. They are the residue of 14,000 years of human experience, encoded in the words we use without thinking, echoing the choices of people who lived and ate and loved a very long time ago. And so, as this story comes to its end, I hope you are feeling warm and comfortable and perhaps a little drowsy. Let the weight of your body sink into wherever you are resting. Let your thoughts drift and soften like flour settling in a bowl. The story of bread is the story of us, of our restless ingenuity and our simple need to eat, of our desire to gather together around a table and share what we have. Wherever you are tonight, I hope there is good bread in your kitchen, and I hope there is someone to share it with. Rest now. Let the story settle around you like a warm blanket. Tomorrow the world will go on turning, and somewhere someone will be kneading dough, just as someone has been kneeling and kneading for 14,000 years. But that is for tomorrow. For now, sleep well, and good night.